The valet barely hid his disgust as the rusted pickup truck pulled up to the gleaming entrance. Peeling paint, dents along the fender, and mud splattered across the windshield. This was no car for the city's most exclusive fundraising gala. He stepped back, arms crossed, silently declaring that this beat-up vehicle was beneath the polished luxury cars lined up under crystal chandeliers. In his eyes, it was an insult to the evening's elegance. Inside, the city's elite mingled in designer gowns and $1,000 suits, their conversations filled with power and prestige. The valet was certain this man wouldn't belong, much less be welcome. He was about to dismiss the truck and send it packing when the driver's door creaked open, breaking the silent judgment hanging in the air. Out stepped a man whose presence instantly transformed the room, for stars gleaming on his uniform, a commanding aura that filled the space. The valet's assumptions shattered in an instant. This wasn't just any guest. This was a 4-star general whose authority could silence a room or end a career with a single phone call. That battered truck wasn't a sign of disrespect or neglect. It was proof that sometimes true honor and power come wrapped in humility, not luxury. And the valet would never look at a vehicle or a person the same way again. Welcome to the silent ranks. Before we dive into this incredible story about respect and the power of true leadership, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories about humility and the consequences of judging by appearances deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this journey. The Grandview Hotel stood like a monument to luxury in the heart of the financial district, its marble facade gleaming under spotlights that could be seen from blocks away. Tonight, it hosted the annual Veterans Foundation Gala, an event that drew the city's most powerful and wealthy citizens together for an evening of charity, networking, and carefully orchestrated social display. Tickets cost $5,000 each, and the guest list read like a directory of influence and affluence. The valet station buzzed with activity as a parade of premium vehicles arrived in steady succession. Bentleys, Mercedes, Teslas, and BMWs created a showroom display along the curved driveway. The valets, dressed in crisp uniforms with gold trim, moved with practiced efficiency, their movements choreographed by years of serving people who expected perfection without having to ask for it. Marcus Webb had been working valet services for upscale events for 12 years, and he took pride in maintaining the standards that separated exclusive gatherings from ordinary occasions. He could identify a car's worth at 50 yards, knew which vehicles belonged in which neighborhoods, and understood that his job involved more than just parking cars. He was a guardian of atmosphere, a protector of ambience, someone who ensured that nothing disrupted the carefully curated experience that wealthy patrons paid premium prices to enjoy. The evening had been proceeding smoothly until the truck appeared. Marcus first spotted it 3 blocks away, moving slowly through traffic that parted around it like water around a stone. Even from a distance, the vehicle looked wrong for this neighborhood, wrong for this event, wrong for everything the evening represented. As it drew closer, the contrast became more pronounced and more embarrassing. The pickup truck was at least 15 years old, possibly older. Its original color was difficult to determine beneath layers of rust, scratches, and the kind of wear that came from years of hard use rather than careful maintenance. The front bumper hung slightly askew, held in place by what appeared to be wire and determination. Mud caked the wheel wells and splattered the sides, suggesting recent travel on unpaved roads that most of the evening's guests would never encounter. Marcus felt his professional composure falter as the truck approached the valet station. Around him, other staff members paused in their duties, uncertain how to handle a situation that fell so far outside their usual parameters. A few guests waiting for their own vehicles turned to stare, their expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed amusement. The truck's engine coughed and rattled, adding an auditory assault to the visual one. When the truck pulled up to the red carpet that had been rolled out for arriving guests, Marcus made a decision that felt both necessary and professionally responsible. He stepped back from the curb, his body language making it clear that he would not be participating in whatever mistake was unfolding before him. The truck idled roughly, its exhaust adding a blue tinge to the evening air that contrasted sharply with the pristine atmosphere the hotel worked so hard to maintain. Marcus approached the driver's side window, but not too closely. His tone was firm and dismissive as he explained that there had obviously been some kind of misunderstanding. This was a private event with strict security protocols. The truck would need to move along before it attracted more attention or caused problems for the legitimate attendees who deserved to enjoy their evening without inappropriate disruptions. The window rolled down with a grinding sound that made Marcus wince. He expected to see exactly what the truck had led him to expect: someone who clearly didn't belong, someone who had either made a wrong turn or was attempting some kind of inappropriate intrusion into a world where they had no business. Instead, he found himself looking into the calm, steady eyes of a man whose presence immediately commanded attention despite his completely ordinary appearance. The driver appeared to be in his early 60s, with silver hair that was neatly trimmed despite showing signs of having been compressed by a cap. His face was weathered but alert, carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of making decisions that mattered. He wore what appeared to be a simple button-down shirt, clean but unremarkable, the kind of clothing that prioritized function over fashion. Everything about him seemed to contradict the truck he was driving and the event he was attempting to attend. When the man spoke, his voice carried the same quiet authority as his appearance, but there was something else underneath it that made Marcus pause despite his professional certainty. The driver explained calmly that he was here for the Veterans Foundation Gala, that he had a ticket and an invitation, and that he would appreciate having his vehicle parked like any other guest's transportation. His tone was polite but carried an undertone that suggested he was accustomed to being taken seriously regardless of circumstances. Marcus found himself in an uncomfortable position. The man's demeanor suggested legitimacy, but everything else about the situation screamed fraud or mistake. The truck alone probably wasn't worth what most guests spent on dinner, let alone what they paid for gala tickets. The driver's clothing, while clean, belonged at a hardware store rather than a $5,000 charity event. Nothing added up in a way that made sense within Marcus's understanding of how exclusive events worked. Other valets had begun to gather, sensing unusual drama but uncertain how to respond. A few guests had stopped their conversations to observe the standoff, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected disruption to the evening's smooth progression. Marcus felt the weight of their attention and the pressure to resolve a situation that was becoming more awkward by the moment. He decided to handle the problem with diplomatic firmness, explaining that while he was sure there had been an honest misunderstanding, this particular event required advance registration and security clearance that clearly hadn't been obtained. Perhaps the gentleman was thinking of a different venue, or perhaps there had been confusion about dates or locations. In any case, the truck would need to move along before it created additional complications for an evening that many important people had been planning for months. The driver listened patiently to Marcus's explanation, his expression remaining calm despite the increasingly public nature of the confrontation. When Marcus finished, the man simply nodded once and began to exit his vehicle. Marcus stepped back, unsure whether this represented escalation or resolution, hoping that the situation wouldn't require calling security or creating a scene that would reflect poorly on the hotel's management of the evening. The truck's door opened with the same grinding protest as the window, and the driver stepped onto the red carpet with movements that were both careful and confident. He was taller than he had appeared while seated, with the kind of posture that suggested military bearing even in civilian clothes. As he straightened to his full height and turned to face Marcus directly, something became visible that changed everything about the encounter in a single, devastating moment. On the man's collar, small but unmistakable in the bright lights of the hotel entrance, were 4 silver stars arranged in a pattern that every American should recognize but few civilians ever see in person. 4 stars that represented the highest levels of military command, authority that extended far beyond any hotel policy or valet protocol, power that made the entire evening's display of wealth and influence seem suddenly small and insignificant. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as he processed what he was seeing. The man standing before him wasn't someone who had made a wrong turn or crashed the wrong party. This was a 4-star general of the United States Army, someone whose decisions affected national security, whose authority extended over hundreds of thousands of personnel, whose presence at any event was an honor that most organizations would spend months preparing to receive properly. The general's expression remained patient, but there was something in his eyes now that suggested he had been testing Marcus rather than simply trying to gain entrance to the gala. He had allowed the valet to make assumptions, to demonstrate exactly the kind of judgment and character that revealed itself when people thought no one important was watching. The test had been failed spectacularly, and both men knew it. Around them, the atmosphere shifted as other staff members and nearby guests began to notice the stars on the general's collar. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A security guard who had been approaching to assist with what appeared to be a problem suddenly snapped to attention with military precision that suggested he recognized both the insignia and its significance. A photographer who had been documenting the evening's arrivals began frantically adjusting his camera settings, realizing he was witnessing something far more significant than the usual parade of local celebrities and business leaders. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to somehow undo the damage he had just inflicted on his own career and the hotel's reputation, but words seemed inadequate to the magnitude of his mistake. He had just refused service to someone whose authority extended far beyond the civilian world, someone whose presence at the gala was probably the most significant honor the Veterans Foundation would receive all year. The general waited patiently while Marcus struggled with the realization of what had just occurred. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm and controlled, but carried implications that made Marcus's knees weak. He observed quietly that it was interesting how quickly assumptions could be made based on appearances, how readily people could decide who belonged and who didn't based on the vehicles they drove rather than who they actually were. He continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the devastating nature of his words, noting that he had driven the same truck for 15 years, through deployments and transfers, through promotions and assignments that had taken him around the world. It was the vehicle he had chosen because it was reliable, functional, and honest in a way that luxury cars weren't. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't, didn't demand attention it hadn't earned, and didn't create barriers between him and the soldiers he commanded who often came from backgrounds where expensive vehicles were impossible dreams rather than expected accessories. The general explained that he had specifically chosen to drive the truck tonight rather than accepting the staff car that had been offered, because he wanted to see how he would be received when he arrived as himself rather than as a title or position. He had wondered whether the evening's celebration of veterans would extend to respect for someone who didn't look like the stereotype of success that charity galas usually attracted. Marcus felt sick as he realized that his behavior had been a test he had failed completely, that his assumptions about worth and belonging had been exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible. The general hadn't been trying to cause problems or create scenes. He had been quietly evaluating whether the organization claiming to honor veterans actually understood what service looked like when it didn't come wrapped in designer suits and luxury vehicles. Other guests had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual nature of the confrontation and the growing awareness that they were witnessing something significant. Among them were several veterans who had served under the general's command, men and women who recognized him immediately despite the civilian setting and informal attire. Their reactions ranged from surprise to deep respect, and several moved to positions that suggested they were prepared to intervene if the situation required it. The hotel's manager, alerted by staff who had recognized the severity of the situation, appeared with the kind of panicked efficiency that came from realizing a catastrophic mistake had been made. He approached the general with profuse apologies, explanations about miscommunication and staff training, and assurances that the situation would be corrected immediately and permanently. The general listened politely but made it clear that apologies to him were less important than understanding why the mistake had been made in the first place. Marcus found himself the center of a teaching moment that would be remembered long after the evening ended. The general used the situation to illustrate points about leadership, respect, and the dangerous tendency to measure people's worth by external indicators rather than character and service. He spoke about soldiers who had died in combat while driving vehicles that wouldn't be considered suitable for parking at charity galas, about heroes whose uniforms had been torn and dirty, about the importance of recognizing that true authority and worth often came in packages that didn't match civilian expectations. The lesson was delivered without cruelty or humiliation, but with the kind of quiet power that made it impossible to ignore or forget. The general made it clear that Marcus's behavior reflected not just personal prejudice but institutional thinking that needed to be examined and corrected. The Valet's assumptions about who belonged and who didn't had revealed something ugly about how society valued people, and that revelation demanded reflection rather than just apology. As the general finished speaking, he turned to Marcus with an expression that mixed disappointment with possibility. He observed that everyone made mistakes, but not everyone had the opportunity to learn from them in such a direct and memorable way. The question now is what Marcus would do with the lesson he had just received, whether he would use it to become better at his job and better as a person, or whether he would simply be more careful about making assumptions in the future. The general then did something that surprised everyone present. Instead of demanding punishment for Marcus or creating additional drama about the situation, he asked the valet to personally park his truck with the same care and respect that would be given to any other guest vehicle. He made it clear that redemption was possible, but only through actions rather than words, only through demonstrated change rather than promised improvement. Marcus approached the battered pickup truck with hands that shook slightly, aware that everyone was watching, aware that his next actions would define not just the rest of his evening but possibly the rest of his career. He opened the door carefully, adjusted the seat and mirrors with unusual attention to detail, and drove the truck to a parking space that was closer to the entrance than most of the luxury vehicles that had arrived earlier. When he returned with the parking ticket, Marcus handed it to the general with a respect that was completely different from his earlier dismissive attitude. The general accepted it with a nod that suggested the lesson had been received and understood, that the evening could now proceed in a way that honored both the event's purpose and the people it was meant to celebrate. Inside the hotel, the general was received with the recognition and respect that his position and service demanded. Veterans who had served under his command approached throughout the evening to pay their respects, sharing stories about his leadership and the impact he had made on their lives and careers. Civilian guests learned about his service record, his decorations, and the responsibilities he carried as one of the military's highest-ranking officers. But the story that spread most quickly through the evening was the one about the valet who had refused to park a beat-up truck until he learned who was driving it. The incident became a teaching moment for everyone present, a reminder that assumptions about worth and belonging could be both wrong and damaging, that respect should be offered freely rather than earned through displays of wealth or status. Marcus spent the rest of the evening reflecting on what had happened and what it meant for how he approached his job and his interactions with people. The general's quiet lesson had been more effective than any formal training or disciplinary action could have been, creating the kind of learning experience that would influence his behavior for years to come. The truck sat in its parking space throughout the evening, looking exactly as out of place as it had when it first arrived. But its presence served as a constant reminder to everyone who saw it that appearances could be deceiving, that true worth wasn't always visible from the outside, and that respect should be based on character and service rather than material possessions. When the evening ended and guests began retrieving their vehicles, Marcus approached the general's truck with the same careful attention he had shown when parking it. He had spent the intervening hours thinking about the lesson he had received, about the assumptions he had made, and about the kind of person he wanted to be in future encounters with people whose stories he didn't know. The general emerged from the hotel surrounded by other veterans and civilian supporters who had been honored to spend the evening in his presence. His departure created the same kind of respectful attention that his arrival should have received, but with the added weight of a lesson learned and a story that would be told long after the evening ended. As the general approached his truck, Marcus stepped forward with the parking ticket and an apology that was both more sincere and more informed than his earlier attempts at damage control. He acknowledged not just the mistake he had made, but the thinking behind it, the assumptions that had led him to judge worth by appearance rather than character. The general accepted the apology with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the evening, making it clear that the lesson was complete and forgiveness was possible. The general climbed into his battered pickup truck, started the engine with its familiar rough idle, and drove away into the night. Behind him, he left a valet service, a hotel, and a group of guests who had learned something important about respect, service, and the dangerous tendency to measure people's worth by what they owned rather than who they were. Marcus continued working valet services, but his approach to the job changed fundamentally after that evening. He began to see each arriving guest as someone with a story he didn't know, someone who deserved respect regardless of their vehicle, their clothing, or their apparent place in society's hierarchy. The lesson of the general's truck became a personal mission to treat everyone with dignity, to avoid assumptions about worth based on appearances, and to remember that true authority and character often came in unexpected packages. The story of the valet who refused to park a four-star general's beat-up truck became legendary in the service industry, shared as both cautionary tale and teaching moment. It illustrated the importance of treating every customer with respect, the danger of making assumptions based on appearances, and the reality that you never know who you're really dealing with until you take the time to find out. The general continued driving his 15-year-old pickup truck, using it as both transportation and teaching tool. His choice to maintain the modest vehicle despite his position and authority served as a constant reminder to himself and others that leadership was about service rather than status, that true worth couldn't be measured by material possessions, and that respect should be earned through character rather than displayed through wealth. The Veterans Foundation Gala raised record amounts that year, but the evening was remembered more for the lesson about respect and assumptions than for the money collected. The incident with the valet became part of the event's legacy, a story that was shared at future gatherings as a reminder of the evening's deeper purpose and the importance of honoring veterans not just with words and donations, but with genuine respect for who they were rather than what they appeared to be. This story was brought to you by the Silent Ranks. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever been judged by your appearance, your clothing, or what you owned rather than who you really were? Or perhaps you've caught yourself making assumptions about others based on what you can see rather than taking time to learn their actual story. Tell us in the comments about a time when appearances were deceiving, when you or someone you know was underestimated because of how they looked or what they drove. And if you think stories about the importance of respect and the danger of assumptions need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.